A lot of translators see verse 3 and they think, oh, John was having doubts about who Jesus was. Because look at what it says in verse 3. Some of the disciples said to him as they sent John sent his disciples to Jesus, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for someone else? It certainly means, it looks at first glance here, that John is in prison and he might be feeling low, like, oh my goodness, I spent all my time dedicated to talking about the Messiah, and now I don't know, is this really him? I don't know. That certainly is what it seems like, but let's think about that. In Matthew chapter 3, as John was baptizing Jesus, we see the Holy Spirit come down as a dove. We also hear the affirmation, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. Do you think that really shook John's faith that this was indeed the Messiah? No, what I rather believe is happening here in verse 3 is that the disciples had a higher view of John, because that's the affinity of man, in that they did not want to just necessarily abandon John and go pursue Christ, which is exactly what John the Baptist would have told them to do so. Because as the disciples come and ask, look how Jesus responds to them. In verse 4, he says, go and report back to John what you hear and see. And then Jesus gives the examples of his divinity and the miraculous signs. And he says, go report back to John what you have seen. Really what Jesus is doing is he's telling John's disciples, here's what I have done. You have seen this for yourself. Go back and tell John how you have changed your mind. Now, why do I say that? I say that I feel very confident that John was not doubting towards who Christ was, that John was not doubting towards Jesus being the Messiah, because look at what Jesus does in his commendation in verse 7. Now, as these men is referring to John the Baptist's disciples, we're going back to report back to John, hey, no, John, you were right, we were wrong, I'm sorry. Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What Jesus is saying, this is a rhetorical question. Did you go out to see John the Baptist teach in the wilderness, who might have been being tossed to and fro by every wind and whim of doctrine? He's asking this in a rhetorical sense. Like, no, you did not go out there to find a man who was not completely confident in the message that he was proclaiming. He was not easily swayed by popular opinion. And then look at verse 8. But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. John did not dress to impress people.